Good morning. Good morning. Welcome. I'm Dr. Petra. Good morning to the Science of Mind class. We're happy to have you with us today. And thank you for Tracy Brown jumping in last Sunday for me. That was really awesome. She does a great job, I know, with you guys. So we are talking about some phases of the subjective life. And so the last chapter that we, it's weird, I'm having to hold my microphone differently than I was taught on the platform. It's great, thank you. Ryan's going to keep giving me the sign to how to hold my microphone properly. So the last couple of weeks we did what the mystics knew, right? And we were all about, you know, the experience of the presence and this very esoteric, beautiful, outward, you know, experience that's really hard to talk about. And now, boom, we've gone into this chapter called Some Phases of the Subjective Life, which is a little more cerebral, a little more humanly focused, and it's actually now moving into our experience of the world, whereas the mystic consciousness is the experience of the absolute, the experience of presence. This idea of the subjective life, universal subjective, is now our engagement with consciousness on the, it's so hard to talk about, on the horizontal axis, right? The vertical axis is this mystical experience of oneness, and the horizontal axis is this, our relationship with physicality and life in form. So you're going to see how this now works and how it's actually different than what we were talking about in the chapter, What the Mystics Knew. So the first section is called race suggestion. Now, when Ernest Holmes in The Science of Mind uses the word race, he's not talking about white or black or any other kind of race the way that we think of it as today. He's using the term race to mean human race. So it's humanity as a whole. You are amazing. Is this for me? Oh my gosh. Somebody got my order through race suggestion, through universal subjective mind. Thank you so much. So race, the idea of human race, right, that we are in a subjective field. We are in a field of consciousness that we actually share. Each individual carries around with them and has written into our mentality impressions which we never consciously thought of as experienced. What we realize is that the individual subjectivity is our use of the one subjective mind. It's our use of the one subjective mind. And so there's a lovely biologist, his name is Rupert Sheldrake, and in the 1980s and 90s he did a whole bunch of studies, and what he calls this is the morphogenetic field. That every species has a field of consciousness within which they operate. So what the Science of Mind is picking up here is the morphogenetic field of humanity. In Rupert Sheldrake's work, actually, and it's not just only in species, what they discovered and the studies that they did, we're on page 348. 348. So what he discovered from his own studies and the studies that when he looked at other people's studies, what he discovered was that you could do experiments on mice and teach them how to go through mazes. And they did this huge experiment that every generation of mice that went through the maze went through it faster and faster until at the, however many generations that is in, a 2-month period of time, however that works. And it's not like they were being taught by their parent mice. They They were separated out. They were run the same maze, but it's not like they were taught by anybody. And they kept running that maze faster and faster and faster, learning it faster and faster and faster, until at the end of the experiment, the mice at the end were running it faster than any mice had ever learned how to run the maze, with no teaching between generations. So then they took that same maze from Europe and America, they took it to Australia. They started with a whole new batch of mice, and those mice ran the maze, learned the maze as fast as the last generation of mice had learned the maze previously. What we would call the 100th monkey, right? But it's not just critical mass. And so he called this the morphogenetic field. They also realized that they went back and they looked at some chemical compound studies that had been done, where they were seeking to create a new compound out of a series of chemicals. And by reading the studies and how they were unfolding, they discovered that when the studies were first done in France, it took a long time for these chemicals to start to crystallize into the compound they were looking for, or to see how it was going to crystallize into what they wanted. And as those studies were repeated around the world with material that was unrelated to the compound from the original studies, so that crystallization happened faster and faster, as if the compounds learned how to crystallize together and no longer had to find their way, right? They knew. And so these two studies sent him on this quest to really look at this. And so he called it the morphogenetic field, that we have that field. And so in the science of mind, Ernest Holmes didn't have the benefit of all these studies. He called it race consciousness. Carl Jung called it the collective unconscious. Edgar Cayce calls it the Akashic records. It's the shared field in what we call universal subjective mind that humanity shares. And it's that shared field in which we have all grown in terms of survival and what's dangerous and how to sense other people and whether they're safe and all of these kinds of things, as well as all the myths and stories and legends from all of our religious traditions that tell us, how life is and why it's so difficult and all of those kinds of things. All of that is shared in this shared field. Ernest Holmes in The Science of Mind called it a mind, universal subjective mind. Today, based on all that we know from science, especially from quantum physics, is we understand these to be fields. And they're literally fields that are part of the fabric of the universe itself. And I saw a hand, so we're going to stop right there before we go any further, because we're going to build on this, because we're going to talk about race suggestion. Then we're going to talk about how that influences us in our families and cultures and corporations and things like that. And then we're going to talk about how it impacts us as individuals. So Sheila had a question. Let's turn to Ryan. He's going to tell us about involved and engagement.
Yeah, you over the most important person. Come on
I know.
Sorry. The guy in the sky has to have a voice every now and then.
That's exactly right. And you don't have to wait for me to say now's the time to you can raise your hand online or like Sheila did. So Ryan, please get us going.
Yeah, so we got to establish some ground rules so we don't get crazy and start yelling things at Dr. Petra.
Hey, wait.
Yeah, as you can see, we're doing this as a hybrid situation. So there's a couple ways to participate. Those who are in the room, just simply raise your hand, and either myself or Richard will hand you a microphone. That way people online can hear what you're saying as well, because this is fruitful for their information. And we're also live on Zoom. And those who are in the Zoom room, they can raise their hand, and I can call you into the room, and that way you can talk and join the conversation. And for those who are watching us on our live stream on Facebook, or you want to comment on Zoom, you can do that inside of the chats as well, and I'll bring those into the room. And I do like to keep those anonymous because we do want to continue to create a safe container for everybody to express themselves. So with that being said, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Real quick, just wouldn't Darwin say that's evolution? Or am I simplifying it too much?
It's a good question, Sheila. Evolution is more the physical interaction, right? So if you go to the Darwin's finches, right, which was the brainstorm for him for evolution, every one of the islands in the Galapagos had slightly different food, and so the finches, their beaks evolved based on the food that was available. So that's a very physical engagement with your environment. This is actually on the field of consciousness, which doesn't really have anything to do with the physical per se, other than the evolution of let's say, all of a sudden humanity discovered fire, and then people got burned, and so now in the subjective field, there's this recognition that fire is dangerous. So it's not just the physical act of having fire, right? But or the possibilities that fire then produces, right? That's in the realm of the idea of that somebody has about fire. And so we're not talking about something physical. We're actually talking about something that is in consciousness. And so in the science of mind, we use the term universal subjective mind or subjective mind. Rupert Sheldrake called it the morphogenetic field, because as we've evolved our understanding in science, we understand that these fields are ubiquitous to the space-time continuum, like the magnetic field or the gravitational field. We have the quantum field. And so he was trying to get a hold of, Sheldrake was trying to get a hold of exactly this, calling it the morphogenetic field. And so what we recognize is that there is a consciousness that humanity has, just as there is a shared consciousness, according to Rupert Sheldrake, of any species, or, well, I mean, you don't think you really qualify chemical compounds as species, but it's still, gold in France is the same as gold in the United States, is the same as gold in Australia, right? They still share properties. There's something shared. And of course, we say consciousness is everywhere. And so what we're getting at is the shared field. And we shall see, he goes on to say, that a subjective unity is maintained between all people, and that individual mentalities who are in sympathetic vibration with each other more or less mingle and receive suggestions from each other. What do we call that today? Like-mindedness. Don't we look for people who are like-minded? They seem kind of energetically similar to us. There's a shared sense of how the world works, and we can find those people, and we talk about it almost by osmosis, right? Because we're in that shared field. Just as each person, place, or thing is a part of this, so does every town, every city, every nation have a consciousness, a shared sense in this subjective mind. And so and that's the seed of stereotypes, right? The Japanese behave a certain way, the Germans behave a certain way. Well, on the one hand, it's a stereotype. On the other hand, there's actually some truth to it. Being born and raised German myself, even though natively I might not be quite as structured as my family would like, I certainly learned how to be structured, right? I very much learned that, and I didn't have to be taught it like, you must be structured. It was just the way the family operated, because we were because we were German, right? And again, stereotypes, there's always the exceptions, but there is that sense of that's where culture comes from. That's where that shared sense of group and type come from. They come out of this shared field. So we have the field of humanity, and then in the field of humanity, we have the field of race, black and white and yellow, right? And then we have inside that, we have the fields of nation, Dutch and American or Japanese and Korean, right? Then we have inside that the field of states or towns, or I mean, just think of, I don't know, what could we say? Like the field of New Orleans compared to the field of Chicago. Another way of saying it, right? But it's not just a physical thing. It's actually this idea that there's this shared sensibility, and that we can access that. And if we're not paying attention, it influences us, right? So I was very much a free spirit, and I was the little girl sitting out in the backyard watching the fairies. And that was not acceptable in a Germanic family. That did not fit into the structure of life, and I was told, don't tell stories. So I learned not to. I learned not to talk about it, and then I learned not to see it because it was not acceptable, right? And so that's a part of what the point of this is. First of all, to understand that it's going on, that it's real, that it's happening, and to recognize that unless we're standing guard at the portals of our own mind, we are being impressed by it. And we see it in our children, right? They're impressed by the consciousness and the field in which they grow up. And so this is what we want to be awakening to, that this is happening, that this is what's going on. It's not good or bad, it's just what is. And subjective mind being universal, the history of the race, human race, is written in the mental atmosphere of the globe on which we live. And we all share in that. All right, Ryan, I see there's a hand out there.
Yeah, can I call Brenda into the room? And Brenda, go ahead and unmute yourself and share.
Hi, Brenda.
Good morning. This brings up a question in terms of individual impact on the morphogenetic field. And the reason I raised that is I've spent the last 48 hours being of a support to a woman with a repetitive history of traumatic relationships that began in childhood and carried into adulthood. And other than becoming safe, as we talk about this field of humanity, and I think about the rising global issues of women's violence, race violence, national violence, within our country violence. And if this is the human mind field, and if rising thoughts raise all ships, then how do we deal with the massive wave as we begin as individuals for a message to change that morphogenic field?
It's a great question, Brenda, and you're just a few chapters ahead of us. So hang tight with your question, because what we're building first is the understanding of how this works. Then we can talk about what do we do once we become conscious and aware of it. All right, so you're right on track, and that is precisely where we want to go. But hang on just a minute and let us build a little bit more of the understanding of it. All right, and then we'll come back to that question. Ryan.
Yeah, I have Connie here who has a question. Connie, do you want to join the room?
Hi, Connie.
Hi, good morning, everybody. You know, I teach English as a second language, and I'm a cultural anthropologist by education. And so I'm very aware of this. And I take great pleasure in diversity, cultural, racial, ethnic diversity, the whole works. And I just love it. It's just a rich field of fun and joy and, exploration and all for me. That I teach my students about important points of American culture. I think it's so important. Just for example, it's very important to be direct, especially in business. You've got to be able to say yes or no. Maybe it's okay and it's appropriate sometimes, but not all the time.
Right.
Now I find that people in China have a very difficult time saying no. They think it's rude and impolite. And so they'll say maybe, or this is fascinating. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And Connie, you're saying something really important. There's so many ways that this shows up, and so many ways that we don't even realize we're being shaped. So in German, you almost never, I mean almost never, start a sentence with I. Almost never. Well, think about how many sentences in English, especially in American English, start with the word I. And so just that is an entirely different mindset. The other thing between the language, between German and English, is in English, you modify the verb. How you're walking fast, you're walking slow, you're walking with other people, right? So you're constantly modifying the verb. In German, you modify the noun. And where it's a very different mindset. So it actually changes the way in which you experience the world. Which is why being bilingual and trilingual is so powerful, because it automatically pushes you out of an accepted way of looking and seeing the world. And that accepted way of looking and seeing the world is this now not just humanity consciousness, but now a cultural consciousness, a local consciousness, right? And it's not just, Connie, your comment was great. It's not just, American and Chinese, let's say. I'm a Yankee. And I don't often speak slow enough, soft enough, or gently enough for especially women who are raised in the South. I'm like abrupt and clipped and rude, and I'm like, yeah, I'm just direct. It's right. So even in the United States, you can see these cultural, and what we recognize is that nobody has to be taught these things. Yes, you pick it up because you hear your parents say it, but it's also ubiquitous in what we're trying to get to is in this field. It's shared at an even deeper level. Remember a few weeks ago, we literally talked about the photons of energy that we're sharing? Right? We're sharing this ubiquitous field, and we are way more sensitive than we know, and we have way more senses than just our physical senses. And so there are exchanges going on and awareness going on at this level, at the level of these fields, which then, of course, moves us directly into the conversation about psychic phenomenon, which we're going to get to in a moment. So, and then to go back to where Brenda was going at the beginning, right, is that we should realize that we are, as we are part of this field, we not only are we sensitive to like-mindedness, but we also are sensitive to recognizable vibrations and recognizable energetic from people, which is, of course, why somebody might go from one traumatic relationship to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, because it's familiar. The energy itself is familiar. The way in which the relationship unfolds is familiar, even though it's bad for us. And so to go on with this, that we can, this is, hang on, here, this is in the next section, subjective mind and inspiration, in the second paragraph. Realizing that the subjective draws to itself everything that is in sympathy with, we see that anyone who is sympathetically inclined toward the race or vibrates to the race thought might pick up the entire race emotion and experience if they were able to bring it to the surface and could consciously depict it. Right? And so in this case, it's talking about race consciousness as a whole, but it's exactly the same thing, right? If you have nation consciousness and cultural consciousness and family consciousness, we pick these things up and we should be able to depict it. We should be able to begin to speak about it, or at least we want to be able to speak about it, and not to be dismissed. Because it's not physical. It's not like physical evolution, right? And it's not like, well, my mother didn't actually teach me that, but she didn't need to. We begin to resonate at that subjective level, for good or for ill. We resonate with it. And think about how many people do you know, or maybe you yourself have experienced it, over the last 2 years with the pandemic, over the last 6 years with the increasing divisiveness in our political situation, with the climate change really coming to the forefront. How many of us have felt this underlying anxiety, this underlying sense of something's wrong, this underlying sense of discomfort, which isn't necessarily from something specific to our own life. What we're experiencing is the morphogenetic field. We're experiencing this race consciousness of humanity, of the climate, of the political divisiveness in the United States, right? We're actually sensitive to those things, and we are experiencing that. When we have this sort of underlying energy and anxiety or depression or just sense of things not being right. And so we can begin to recognize that this is what's happening. Yes, in fact, we have the senses and the awareness to actually feel those things. Anyone contacting the subjective side of the race mentality with the ability to bring it to the surface will have at their disposal an emotional knowledge that many lifetimes of hard study could not accumulate. Right? We can actually sense and feel what's going on. And I use the word sense advisedly because it's not an emotion. It's not an emotional response. But just like we sense with our ears and our eyes and our nose what's physically around us, right? We sense what's in the field. Now, he goes on to say, I always really appreciate this about the science of mind. If one has to surrender one's individuality in the process, it would be better to remain ignorant. And the reason this statement is made here is because we don't have to become unconscious. We don't have to set ourselves aside. We don't have to have some, 10,000-year-old entity reveal it to us. We actually are capable of having that engagement ourselves. And we should trust it when we do. Because we are, in fact, seeing, hearing, feeling, sensing something around this experience. For those of you who've been with me now for the last number of weeks, feel how different that is than the conversation that we've had about the mystics, who are always moving to the fullest universal truth, which is the same no matter what culture, no matter what religious background, no matter what language you use, right? That's what we call the vertical axis. And in the equilateral cross, whether it's the equilateral Celtic cross or there's lots of different versions of that, right? That's what's being got at. That there's the vertical axis, which axis, not access, axis, which is the mystical experience of the universal truths. And then there's the horizontal axis, which is not only our experience of physicality, but this experience of these individuated, subjective realities that are in the field. So they're truth with a little t, not truth with a capital T. It is true that humanity has been afraid of the other. It is true that certain races, colors have been subjected to the other. It is true, right? These are truths with a small t, not truth with a capital T. So in the universal subjective field, universal subjective mind, we can sense and feel the reality of those things. And it's in the mystical awareness that we can compare, that we can discern whether it's truth with a capital T. Which is how we can say, well, of course it's not true that some races should be subjected to others. It's ridiculous, because it is utterly not in alignment with truth with a capital T, which is we're all one. We're all part of the same. We're all part of the whole. But it is true with a small t that that is people's reality, and it is a belief they hold no matter how false it is. Do you see the difference, right? And so when we are available to universal subjective mind, do you see we can begin to bring all these unconscious biases, all these false beliefs, we can actually bring them to the surface, depict them. If we are sensitive enough, we will have at our disposal an emotional knowledge that many lifetimes of hard study could not accumulate, that we would be able to depict them, speak about it, and speak about how not in alignment with truth with a capital T it is. Does it make sense, right? And so we're starting to wend our way kind of towards the answer to Brenda's question, right? That's one of the ways in which we become bearers of the light. We bring light to what's in the subjective field and say, wait a minute, we bring the mystical light to it and say, wait, that's not truth with a capital T. What would it look like if it were actually in alignment with this truth, the universal truth? And so we begin to become a new influence into universal subjective mind. Because if universal subjective mind, if this field is the sum total of everything that humanity has thought and believed and experienced, collected in there, right? The more of us that think and believe and experience something different, what are we doing? We're adding something new, right? The whole thing about the world being flat. And then somebody ran around the world, and they, and Copernicus and Galileo, and then they circumnavigated the globe, and all of a sudden, the globe's no longer flat, the Earth's no longer flat, it's round. And so that becomes the shared understanding that we live in this a different physical experience. And so we're constantly adding and being impressed upon by this universal subjective mind or field. We're constantly engaged, whether we like it or not. This is happening. Just like you and I right now, well, if we're probably exchanging photons of light across the internet too. Who knows? I have no idea, right? But we're certainly exchanging them here in the room, and we don't even know it, right? We have no sense of it, and it's the same thing that's going on. So the last piece then of this is this third little section called mental atmosphere. Each person has a mental atmosphere which is the result of all that they have thought, said, done, and consciously or unconsciously perceived. So we ourselves have our own little field, right? And this mental atmosphere is very real and is the subtle influence which constitutes the power of personal attraction. For personal attraction has but little to do with looks. Going back again to Brenda's question about, or comment, right, of the traumatic experience over and over and over again, or the same boss, no matter how many different jobs you have, or the same experience at a job where you're overlooked or not appreciated or whatever, right, whatever it is, job to job to job to job, right, because we bring our own mental atmosphere And that is an attractive force. And so we're going to attract that which corresponds to our own mental atmosphere. And so, I mean, and that's where that idea of, it's sort of the grossest statement of it. Well, if you expect to be loved, you get loved. And if you expect not to be loved, then that's what you're going to receive, right? It's not as simplistic as that, because we can certainly, in our minds and in our hearts, expect to be loved. But if our subconscious field, our subjective field, doesn't buy it, doesn't feel it, doesn't live in that space, right? We are actually attracting out of that, not out of what we decide to expect or hope to have. Do you see? And so these things are all playing together. They're all playing in this engagement that we have now with not just physicality, the space-time continuum, but the consciousness, this subjective reality that is playing out below the surface of our consciousness. All right, we're going to stop there. I see we have a hand in the room checking in for anything online, but let's come over here and please, Patty, say your name. Of course, I just did for you, but that's okay. And share your thought.
My name is Patty. And I came up against this in a very, very visceral way this last week. In that for several weeks I had prepared myself to ask for a raise. I worked for a woman who grew up very, very poor, dirt poor as we would say. She has more than enough money for her and her family, but she doesn't experience it that way. So when I asked for a raise, it was like I attacked her.
Wow.
And we have shared, she's a Baptist with a capital B. I have gone to the Baptist church with her every other week. But I came to her when I started. I've always said that I would not work for anyone I could not love. And this woman is full of love. So I appealed to that, but I was crying. It was painful to do that. And yet I think both of us grew in this field. I got the raise.
Good for you.
But I think that both of us, without realizing it, came to a new level of consciousness.
Thank you for sharing that, Patty. And I thought, you thank you so much, and congratulations for standing your ground and speaking from your heart, right? And how amazing it is to recognize that someone can have all the money in the world but not experience that. And that's the subjective field. That's what is meant by we live in our own subjective field, and then our families, our culture, we have subjective fields, right? So we can live in a subjective field where we never have enough, no matter how much we have, or we can live in a subjective field that says no matter what, all my needs are taken care of. Right? That becomes the way in which we move in the world. Not stupidly, spending money we don't have, but really trusting that our needs are actually met. And then that becomes the atmosphere in which we walk around in. And I'm sure you've worked in businesses where the atmosphere is, don't make the boss mad. Oh my God, you can't make a mistake. You're out of here the minute you make a mistake or whatever. Or you've been in, businesses where it's, let's be innovative. Let's see what we can do. How can we grow, right? And you can feel it. You can feel it in the atmosphere. And that's what we're trying to get a hold of here. And so the question is then, as Brenda so beautifully talked about, right, is that while we are influenced by this, as we know, we can consciously influence our own subjective mind. Our spiritual practices are all designed to influence our subjective mind. Our affirmations are using neuroplasticity to rewrite the synaptic patterns in our brain. Our spiritual mind treatment is designed to move us into that place where we recognize that we're co-creative. Meditation is designed to open us to the discipline that we have in our own consciousness and to recognize that we're not our thoughts, our feelings, or our body. That there's actually something that is more than all of those things, which also gives us access to this subjective field, because we're not our subjective field either. We're not all those things that we've taken on as if they were true. We're not the atmosphere that we've walked around most of our life in, right? Those are things that have been created, but we have the ability to engage differently. And then, as was said earlier, right, this is the idea of the 100th monkey. It's a story similar to what some of these stories from Rupert Sheldrake. There is some question as to whether it's a factual story or whether it's an allegory, a fable, but it points to the same thing. When enough people think something new, add something new to the field, some sort of critical mass is reached, and the fundamental shape of the field shifts. All of a sudden, something that was unacceptable and unacceptable and unacceptable and unacceptable, surprisingly enough, becomes okay, right? Or vice versa. Something that was acceptable, acceptable becomes unacceptable. These are the kinds of cataclysmic shifts in consciousness, in a cultural consciousness, in the consciousness of humanity. In the last 200, 300, 400 years, the shift of how people can just be wasted, whether they're slaves, whether they're peasants, whether they're for tens of thousands of years, it's been, the 10% on top and everybody else doesn't count in whatever system you're in. But in the last 200, 300, 400 years, we've woken up to the fact that that's not okay. And we can see these shifts happening slower than we would like, but we can see them happening. And so this is the idea then of critical mass in consciousness. And really points then to Brenda's comment that and I think this is a part of what it means to be a light worker. We're bringing light to these beliefs, unconscious biases, false thoughts that are ubiquitous in this universal field, and we're bringing something new. We're saying, no, that's not in alignment with spiritual truth. This is actually what's in alignment with the spiritual truth. And the more of us that do that, the more light we shed on it, the more of us that do that, the more we're adding something new into the field. So rather than becoming despondent, apathetic, or depressed, what I notice for myself is I just get madder and more determined. No, I'm not going to fall into that. Absolutely going to keep believing what I believe, and I'm going to keep adding that into universal subjective mind because I think it makes a difference. And as all of us do that, right, we're shifting consciousness. And that's a part of what we mean when we say shifting consciousness. It's not just individual consciousness. We are literally shifting collective consciousness. All right, so lots of good things to think about. So do think about them over the course of the next week. We are going to continue on in this particular chapter, talking about how we ourselves can engage in it, how can we participate in it, how can we pay attention to what we've taken on that isn't actually in alignment with what we say we believe, all of those kinds of things, and continuing to explore ways in which we can add a new thought into universal subjective mind. So we look forward to seeing you at the celebration in 30 minutes. And if you're in the local area in DFW, don't forget to join us on Thanksgiving, 11 o'clock gratitude celebration, 12 o'clock potluck. And I'll see you next Sunday. Bye for now.